What happens to the geopolitics of the Middle East when the United States and Iran both realize that a final, stable resolution between them is structurally impossible? For more than 4 decades, since the autumn of 1979, the underlying architecture of this relationship has been built on the premise of eventual closure. The assumption in Washington, across multiple administrations and varying strategic doctrines, was that sufficient economic and diplomatic pressure would eventually force a definitive outcome. This outcome was envisioned either as a comprehensive capitulation on nuclear development and regional proxy support, or as a structural collapse of the clerical system in Tehran. The corresponding assumption within the leadership of the Islamic Republic was that sustained resistance, coupled with the slow expansion of regional proxy networks, would eventually exhaust American political will. The internal theory was that Washington would be forced into a permanent withdrawal from the Persian Gulf, leaving Iran as the undisputed security guarantor of the region. Both of these frameworks were, at their core, theories of victory. Both imagined a clear, historical endpoint. Underneath the surface, the load-bearing assumption was different. The diplomatic efforts of the past decade, most notably the pursuit and subsequent collapse of the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, were fundamentally attempts to script that endpoint, to place formal boundaries around the friction so that a broader regional stabilization could take root. But the structural picture suggests that this entire paradigm of seeking a definitive resolution has quietly expired. The geopolitical system of the Middle East is no longer moving toward a grand, transformative bargain, nor is it hurtling toward an apocalyptic, regime-ending war. Instead, the trajectory, if extended, leads to a condition of permanent, institutionalized friction. In this new era, the primary goal of both capitals is no longer to solve the geopolitical problem, but merely to pace it, ensuring the conflict remains within tolerable operational limits. The inflection point for this realization, the moment the old paradigm fractured completely, arrived during the maritime economic trap in the spring of 2026. The events of those months served as the ultimate proof of concept for the no-closure era. When the United States naval blockades severely restricted maritime traffic, resulting in a roughly 80% drop in Iranian oil exports, it represented the absolute maximum application of economic and military coercion, short of direct kinetic strikes on sovereign Iranian infrastructure. Simultaneously, the Iranian response of effectively closing the Strait of Hormuz to commercial shipping demonstrated the absolute limit of asymmetrical deterrence. What was observable from open sources during this period was a terrifying mutual gridlock. Both sides successfully deployed their ultimate systemic leverage, and both discovered that while they possessed the capacity to inflict unacceptable global economic damage, neither could translate that damage into a strategic victory or a forced concession. The dual blockades did not compel a surrender, they only clarified the immutable boundaries of the stalemate. This mutual realization fundamentally alters the strategic geometry of the entire region. The diplomatic engagements that followed, specifically the stalled negotiations in Islamabad, must be understood not as a hopeful return to the era of seeking a final comprehensive deal, but as the first crude mechanisms of this new phase. These talks are not designed to resolve the core structural differences between Washington and Tehran. They are designed to establish the daily rules of engagement for a permanent, highly militarized standoff. The United States and Iran have entered a paradigm where they are essentially managing the structural ceiling of their hostility, recognizing that any attempt to break definitively through that ceiling destroys the global economic foundation upon which both of their domestic and regional strategies depend. The era of the grand bargain is conclusively over, replaced by a permanent architecture where the highest diplomatic achievement is simply preventing the friction from detonating the global supply chain, setting the stage for a completely different kind of regional struggle. To understand how completely the strategic geometry has shifted, it is necessary to examine the baseline that governed this adversarial relationship for over 4 decades. Since the 1979 revolution overthrew the monarchy in Tehran, the bilateral dynamic has operated under an assumption of transition, a belief that the status quo was a temporary aberration that would eventually resolve into a clear historical end state. In Washington, this baseline was institutionalized as a policy of containment punctuated by economic warfare, designed to degrade the state capacity of the Islamic Republic, until it either altered its behavior fundamentally or fractured internally. The architectural design of American sanctions, from the early frozen assets to the sweeping secondary sanctions of the modern era, was never meant to be a permanent containment wall. It was explicitly designed as a lever to force a final choice. This approach assumed that a nation could not indefinitely sustain a modern economy while isolated from the global financial system, and that eventually, the domestic pressure would become unbearable for the clerical leadership. Conversely, the baseline operating inside Tehran was built on an equally absolute theory of historical inevitability. The founding doctrine of the Islamic Republic, established by Ruhollah Khomeini and maintained under the current supreme leader, Ali Khamenei, viewed the presence of the United States in the Middle East as an unnatural, unsustainable projection of imperial power. The strategic logic of the regime, particularly within the elite ranks of the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, dictated that the ultimate security of Iran could only be guaranteed by creating an outer crust of asymmetric deterrence. This crust took the form of deeply embedded non-state partners across the region, creating a forward defense network that shifted the theater of potential conflict away from Iran's borders and directly into the security calculations of American allies. For decades, Tehran believed that time was on its side, and that by raising the human and financial cost of American regional hegemony, Washington would eventually replicate its historical withdrawals from other distant theaters. There is a useful historical reference point here in the way the Cold War was managed prior to the era of détente, where both superpowers initially operated under the delusion that the other system would collapse under its own structural contradictions. For the United States and Iran, this mutual expectation of an ultimate breakdown created a unique diplomatic theater, where negotiations were rarely seen as tools for managing permanent coexistence, but rather as tactical pauses to regroup or as mechanisms to lock in a temporary advantage. Even the historic negotiation of the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action in the mid-2010s was viewed by its architects not as a final piece, but as a mechanism to delay a nuclear crisis while waiting for broader generational changes to alter the internal politics of Iran. When that framework collapsed, it exposed the raw reality that neither side was willing or able to make the foundational compromises required for a stable regional settlement. This historical baseline has now run into an unyielding wall of structural reality. The assumption that either side could achieve its total political objective has been systematically dismantled by the actual performance of the two states over the past decade. The economic architecture of Iran proved remarkably resilient, adapting through a sophisticated gray market network that allowed it to survive maximum pressure, while the United States demonstrated that its domestic political system lacked the appetite for the kind of massive, high-risk military intervention required to physically dismantle the Iranian state apparatus. The old baseline was a product of an era when both capitals still believed in the possibility of a clean historical exit, an exit that the systemic friction of recent years has proven to be entirely illusory. The structural pressures that have accumulated beneath this relationship are multi-layered and increasingly independent of whoever happens to occupy the executive offices in Washington or Tehran. Over the past decade, the internal system of the Islamic Republic has been absorbing three distinct compounding strains at once. The first is a profound demographic transition. The generation that fought the Iran-Iraq War and carried the memories of the 1979 revolution is rapidly aging out of active institutional control. The median age of the Iranian population has risen significantly, creating a massive societal cohort that has no personal connection to the foundational myths of the state and whose primary experience has been economic stagnation. The second pressure is the structural ceiling of the Iranian domestic economy. Underneath the official declarations of resistance, the deep tissue of the Iranian financial system has been severely degraded by decades of isolation, resulting in persistent high inflation, capital flight, and an inability to modernize the critical infrastructure required to diversify away from energy exports. This economic limitation connects directly back to the signature crisis of the spring of 2026. when the 80% drop in oil exports under the pressure of the United States naval blockade exposed the raw vulnerability of a state completely reliant on informal gray market energy channels. While the regime survived that specific maritime economic trap by deploying its own counter-blockade at the Strait of Hormuz, the episode demonstrated that the adaptive capacity of the Iranian economy is running out of room. The third strain is ideological fatigue. The state is finding it increasingly difficult to mobilize its domestic population using the traditional anti-imperialist narratives that sufficed in the 1980s and 1990s. On the American side, the structural pressures are equally unyielding. Washington is absorbing a profound overextension of its global naval capacity, driven by the structural requirement to pivot resources toward the Indo-Pacific theater to manage the long-term challenge from China. For the United States Navy, maintaining a continuous, heavy aircraft carrier strike group presence in the Persian Gulf is no longer an easy operational baseline. It represents a significant strain on a surface fleet that is simultaneously tasked with patrolling the South China Sea and maintaining commitments to Northern Europe. This structural overextension is compounded by a deep domestic electorate fatigue within the United States, where there is virtually zero political appetite for another open-ended military conflict in the Middle East. Consequently, American strategists are trapped by their own structural math. They possess the naval power to inflict a catastrophic 80% drop in Iranian commerce as they did in the spring of 2026, but they lack the sustainable surplus power or the domestic political mandate to occupy, transform, or permanently police the space after the dust settles. What the structural narrative reveals is two highly militarized states, both facing severe internal constraints, locked in an architecture where neither can afford to back down and neither can afford to break the gridlock completely. The version that gets reported and the version that is actually operating are not the same picture, a reality that became unmistakably clear during the rapid transition from the acute military confrontations of February 2026 to the diplomatic stalemate currently unfolding in Islamabad. When naval assets initially traded kinetic strikes in the southern waters of the Persian Gulf, the immediate assumption across global media networks was that the relationship had finally crossed the threshold into an uncontainable total war. Yet, what open-source tracking and subsequent diplomatic positioning actually reveal is a highly choreographed, almost clinical attempt by both Washington and Tehran to re-establish broken operational boundaries. The escalation did not trigger an uncontrolled spiral. Instead, it forced both capitals to the negotiating table in Pakistan, not to sign a historic peace agreement, but to construct a permanent stabilization mechanism for their ongoing rivalry. This shift in diplomatic intent illustrates the core characteristic of the no-closure era, where negotiations are no longer designed to solve the structural underlying conflict, but are instead engineered to pace it. The talks in Islamabad are structurally distinct from the old frameworks of the prior decade, as there is no longer any serious discussion about the total dismantling of Iran's nuclear enrichment capabilities, nor is there any expectation that Washington will lift its core primary sanctions architecture. What is being negotiated is a highly specific, transactional ceiling on hostile actions, an agreement on exactly how much enrichment Tehran can pursue before triggering a kinetic response, balanced against exactly how much economic breathing room Washington will tolerate through the informal enforcement of its energy embargo. The necessity of this managed friction became absolute following the maritime economic trap of the spring of 2026, an episode that demonstrated the catastrophic global consequences of allowing the conflict to breach its structural limits. When the United States naval blockade successfully engineered an 80% drop in Iranian oil exports, it proved that Washington could effectively sever the financial arteries of the state, but the subsequent closure of the Strait of Hormuz by Iranian forces threatened to trigger a global economic depression. The realization that maximum pressure automatically triggers maximum asymmetrical retaliation has forced an evolutionary leap in how both states approach diplomacy. The current engagements are fundamentally diagnostic, serving as a communication channel to ensure that neither side miscalculates the other's tolerance thresholds during periods of localized escalation. Consequently, the stalled nature of the Islamabad talks should not be interpreted as a diplomatic failure, but rather as proof that the framework is functioning exactly as intended by acting as a shock absorber. The official narrative ends where the structural narrative begins, revealing that both the administration of Masoud Pezeshkian and American national security strategists are comfortable with a permanent state of unresolved tension, provided the parameters remain predictable. By transforming diplomacy from a tool of resolution into a tool of operational pacing, both actors are adapting to a reality where the conflict cannot be won, cannot be settled, and cannot be abandoned, locking them into a highly managed, permanent standoff that completely redefines regional security. The internal logic driving the decision-making architecture inside Tehran is shaped by a complex intersection of institutional survival and generational transition. Within the senior leadership of the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, the structural gridlock of the modern era is not viewed as a strategic failure, but rather as a validation of their foundational doctrine of resistance. For the command structure of the Revolutionary Guard, the ability to withstand the maximum economic warfare of the West while maintaining operational dominance over critical maritime corridors confirms that their asymmetric model is effective. The institutional empire of the Revolutionary Guard, which has grown to command a massive percentage of the Iranian domestic economy through informal trading networks and front companies, thrives precisely within the gray zones created by permanent international isolation. For these actors, a total diplomatic resolution or a grand bargain with the United States represents an existential threat to their domestic economic monopoly and their ideological legitimacy. They have built an entire corporate and security apparatus that requires the existence of an external adversary to justify its sweeping internal authority. Simultaneously, the formal state administration under President Masoud Pezeshkian operates under a completely different set of structural incentives. The Pezeshkian government must manage the daily reality of a highly strained domestic population, where prolonged inflation and infrastructure decay pose a constant threat to internal stability. From the perspective of the presidency, the primary goal is not the total defeat of the American regional presence, which they recognize as a military impossibility, but the acquisition of sustainable economic breathing room. This produces a complex internal balancing act, where the diplomatic apparatus attempts to utilize the stalled talks in Islamabad to ease the enforcement of energy sanctions, even as the security apparatus continues to fortify its regional forward defense networks. What appears to be a contradictory foreign policy is actually a highly rational coalition strategy designed to ensure that the state does not fracture under the weight of its own internal contradictions. This internal math inside Iran directly impacts how external regional actors are calibrating their own long-term strategies. For decades, traditional American allies, like Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates, operated under the assumption that the United States would eventually deliver a conclusive resolution to the Iranian challenge, either through a decisive military intervention or a transformative diplomatic agreement. The maritime economic trap of 2026 shattered that long-standing expectation, demonstrating to Riyadh and Abu Dhabi that an unmanaged escalation between Washington and Tehran would immediately transform their own critical energy infrastructure into a primary battleground. Consequently, the structural narrative reveals a profound shift in the behavior of the Gulf states, who are increasingly bypassing the traditional American security umbrella to engage in direct, pragmatic de-escalation channels with Tehran. Rather than waiting for an American victory that will never arrive, these actors are building their own regional stabilization mechanisms, acknowledging that they must permanently coexist with a highly armed, unresolvable Iranian state. This leaves Israel in an increasingly isolated strategic posture, facing a path-dependent reality, where its primary security partner in Washington is structurally restricted from delivering the definitive regional resolution that Israeli military doctrine has traditionally demanded. The shift toward a permanent, managed standoff between the United States and Iran has fundamentally altered the strategic calculations of the surrounding regional powers, who can no longer base their long-term national security on the expectation of a conclusive Western victory or a total Iranian collapse. For decades, the primary alignment in the Persian Gulf was defined by a shared reliance on the American security umbrella, with traditional allies operating under the assumption that Washington would ultimately suppress or dismantle Iran's regional ambitions. However, the realization that both major adversaries are now locked in a structural stalemate has forced a profound recalibration across the capitals of the Middle East, altering how regional states hedge against risk and manage their own borders. This recalibration is most visible in the diplomatic behavior of Saudi Arabia, a state that has historically viewed Iran as an existential, ideological, and geopolitical rival. Underneath the traditional rhetoric, Riyadh has increasingly chosen to prioritize economic diversification and domestic transformation over open-ended regional confrontation, a choice that requires a predictable and stable maritime environment. The maritime economic trap of the spring of 2026 served as an absolute warning to Saudi leadership, proving that any unchecked escalation in the narrow corridors of the Persian Gulf would immediately transform their own critical energy infrastructure into a primary target. Rather than waiting for an American military solution that Washington lacks the domestic political mandate to deliver, Saudi Arabia has systematically deepened its direct bilateral communication channels with Tehran, seeking pragmatic stabilization agreements that bypass the traditional Western alliance architecture. A similar logic governs the strategic posturing of the United Arab Emirates, which has long operated as a global financial and logistical hub dependent on the unhindered flow of international commerce. For Abu Dhabi, the lesson of recent maritime friction was clear, namely that their economic model cannot survive a prolonged, low-grade conflict that drives global shipping insurance rates to unsustainable levels. Consequently, the Emirates have pursued an aggressive strategy of diplomatic de-escalation, positioning themselves as a vital commercial bridge even while maintaining a sophisticated defense posture. By engaging directly with the administration of Masoud Pezeshkian, the United Arab Emirates are actively working to decouple their immediate economic security from the broader, unresolvable ideological struggle between Washington and Tehran, treating the regional stalemate not as a temporary crisis to be solved, but as a permanent environment to be managed. This widespread shift toward local accommodation leaves Israel in an increasingly complex and isolated strategic position. Unlike the Gulf monarchies, Israel views Iran's nuclear advancement and its network of non-state partners as an immediate existential threat that cannot be managed through economic pacing or diplomatic de-escalation. As its regional neighbors establish independent stabilization mechanisms with Tehran, Israeli military planners face a path-dependent reality, where their primary security partner in Washington is structurally restricted from delivering the definitive, regime-ending resolution that Israeli defense doctrine has traditionally anticipated. This divergence in threat perception creates a highly volatile secondary dynamic, where Israel may feel compelled to act independently to disrupt the Iranian network, even as the United States and the Gulf states work to keep the permanent friction within predictable, manageable boundaries. What the public conversation has not yet absorbed is the structural reality below it, specifically the profound path dependence problem that prevents either Washington or Tehran from making a clean exit from their adversarial posture. This permanent lock-in became undeniably clear following the inflection signal of the spring of 2026 maritime economic trap, an episode that demonstrated how both states are prisoners of their own accumulated strategic investments. For the United States, any formal relaxation of its comprehensive secondary sanctions architecture would require a level of domestic political consensus that simply does not exist across its legislative and executive branches. Over the course of 4 decades, the containment of Iran has been deeply codified into American law, transforming what began as a flexible foreign policy tool into an automated, rigid legal framework that no single administration can easily dismantle without incurring severe domestic political costs. Furthermore, the United States is constrained by its commitments to its traditional allies in the region, who view any unilateral American concession to Tehran as a direct threat to their own existential security boundaries. If Washington were to unilaterally scale back its naval presence or lift its energy embargo without achieving a total, verified dismantling of Iran's forward defensive networks, it would risk fracturing its remaining alliances in the Persian Gulf and triggering an uncontrolled conventional arms race. This structural constraint means that even when American strategists recognize that maximum pressure has hit its economic ceiling, their only viable option is to maintain the existing containment wall while utilizing discreet, quiet, diplomatic channels to pace the daily friction. Inside Iran, the path dependence problem is even more acute, as the entire institutional architecture of the state has been engineered to survive and legitimize itself through the mechanism of permanent resistance. The Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps has spent decades building a sprawling, informal economic empire that relies directly on the existence of international sanctions to maintain its monopoly over the domestic market and gray market trade routes. For this elite security cohort, a comprehensive diplomatic normalization with the West would introduce transparency and international competition, directly undermining their domestic financial power and dissolving the ideological justification for their sweeping domestic authority. The trajectory, if extended, shows that the regional forward defense network constructed by Tehran has achieved a level of autonomy that makes it nearly impossible for the central government in the capital to dismantle, even if the administration of Masoud Pezeshkian desired a grand bargain. These non-state partners across the region have developed their own local political imperatives and survival instincts, meaning they can no longer be turned off, like a simple switch, by a diplomatic communiqué from Tehran. Consequently, both capitals are structurally trapped by the very systems they built to protect themselves. They are locked into a permanent adversarial alignment, where the domestic and strategic costs of making peace are significantly higher than the manageable costs of maintaining a state of low-grade, institutionalized friction. Extending the current trajectory produces three observable possibilities for how this no-closure era will be managed over the coming decade. The first scenario, which current indicators suggest is the most likely path, can be described as institutionalized gray zone attrition. In this trajectory, neither the United States nor Iran attempts to alter the foundational balance of power, but both accept a highly regulated cycle of low-grade economic and asymmetric friction. Washington continues to enforce its primary sanctions framework while quietly tolerating a baseline level of Iranian oil exports to prevent a catastrophic spike in global energy prices. Tehran, in turn, maintains its regional forward defense networks and keeps its nuclear enrichment activities just below the threshold that would trigger a massive conventional military response. This path requires both capitals to continuously fine-tune their operational limits, treating localized skirmishes not as preludes to war, but as routine diagnostic tests to re-verify the boundaries of mutual deterrence. The signature mechanics of this scenario were clearly demonstrated during the maritime economic trap of the spring of 2026, where severe disruption was ultimately contained because both sides recognized that crossing the final line meant mutual economic ruin. The second scenario, which remains highly possible but carries a greater risk of unintended acceleration, is the formalization of proxy ceiling enforcement. Under this framework, the United States and Iran utilize third-party intermediaries, such as the ongoing diplomatic channel in Islamabad, to explicitly codify the rules of engagement for regional non-state actors. Washington would essentially agree to limit its kinetic strikes against partner forces in exchange for a binding commitment from Tehran to suppress any actions that threaten international shipping lanes or major civilian infrastructure. This scenario depends heavily on the internal cohesion of both systems, requiring the administration of Masoud Pezeshkian to exert unprecedented disciplinary control over regional networks that have historically operated with significant operational autonomy. If the central authority in Tehran fails to enforce these boundaries, or if political shifts in Washington dismantle the diplomatic backchannels, this scenario rapidly degrades, transforming managed friction back into an unpredictable and highly volatile crisis. The third and least likely scenario is a structural breakdown of the containment architecture, leading to an unmanaged escalation. This path would be triggered if an internal economic collapse or an abrupt leadership transition inside Iran forces the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps to execute a high-stakes geopolitical gamble to preserve its domestic authority. Alternatively, a fundamental shift in American domestic politics could produce an administration determined to break the structural stalemate through direct, large-scale kinetic intervention against Iranian sovereign territory. This trajectory would completely shatter the fragile stabilization mechanisms built after the confrontations of 2026. Forcing regional states like Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates to completely abandon their independent de-escalation strategies and prepare for an all-out regional conflict. Because the global economic consequences of this trajectory are so severe, the internal logic of both the American national security apparatus and the leadership in Tehran works continuously to foreclose it, making permanent, managed stagnation the path of least resistance for both empires. Most analysis of the past several months has assumed that the relevant question is whether the United States and Iran can eventually discover a diplomatic formula to revive the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, or whether they are destined to slide into an uncontrolled regional war. That framing rests on an assumption that no longer matches the structural picture. The harder question, the one that the underlying data from the 2026 confrontations is actually pointing toward, is how both systems will adapt to a permanent architecture of managed hostility that can neither be resolved by diplomacy nor ended by military victory. Because if the answer to that question is what the underlying conditions suggest, then the Middle East has entered a post-resolution era where containment is no longer a temporary bridge to an end state, but the end state itself. And the policy conversation in Washington and Tehran has not yet caught up to that. The threshold that the international community will need to find its way across is learning to monitor the highly specific indicators that signal whether this permanent friction is remaining within its institutionalized limits. The first major data point to watch for over the next 6 months is the volume of informal oil clearances recorded through gray market shipping data, which will tell us exactly how much economic breathing room the administration of Masoud Pezeshkian has successfully negotiated in exchange for maintaining the nuclear ceiling. Simultaneously, analysts must closely monitor the domestic security appointments within the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps to observe whether the pragmatic constraints of the presidency are being matched by the operational behavior of the security apparatus. And they will dictate the daily baseline of regional security far more than any official communique from a formal peace conference. This analytical shift requires a completely different lens for understanding the next decade of geopolitical competition in the Persian Gulf. By recognizing that the conflict is path-dependent and structurally locked, viewers can look past the sensationalized headlines of imminent war or breakthrough deals and focus instead on the real, load-bearing indicators of managed attrition. If you want to track how these structural pressure layers continue to reshape global energy security and regional alliances, hit the subscribe button to stay updated as the next major data points emerge. I want to hear your perspective in the comments section below. Do you believe the United States and Iran can successfully pace this permanent friction, or will the internal math of one of these systems eventually force an unmanaged acceleration that shatters the gridlock? Let me know your thoughts, and stay tuned for our next deep dive into the shifting architecture of global grand strategy.